Hi, my name is Daria Mizantsova and welcome to Politeka World Show. In today's show, we'll talk about the following. What goals does Putin pursue when he is doing everything possible to up the ante in its war? Invest in Belarusian private army, increase its military forces, and so on. The new stage of the war in Ukraine. Some Ukrainian officials claim it can be another breakthrough of Ukraine army in January. What factors will be decisive in it? Did the pivotal moment take place in the vision of the military aid to Ukraine by United States? We will talk about it with our expert. With us today is the chair of Urban Warfare Studies, John Specer. John, I'm happy to have you here, and I would like to tell you thank you for the work you do for supporting Ukraine and made these tweets. I had read a lot and made these interviews and everything you did and will do for my country and for our victory.
Well, thank you. I think it's an honor to be with you, and it's an honor to be on Ukrainian TV or news, because I think it is a global fight, and I had a chance to visit in July. Very touching to me for both personal and professional reasons.
So, John, how do you feel? How global now this fight? And could we tell that Russia did lose this war politically?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to teach military strategy at West Point, and from a strategy perspective, as in a nation trying to achieve political goals through the use of force, Russia lost this war back in April when it was defeated in the Battle of Kyiv and Chernihiv and many other cities, and it could not take Ukraine as a nation. So the war was over at that point. But of course, the objectives of wars do change, and Russia changed its objectives to now the Donbass and southern Ukraine. I mean, why is it a global fight? I feel very strongly, but when Putin crossed Ukraine's sovereign borders, it changed the world. Nothing since World War II has been as important as this war, where Putin said, I don't care about the UN Charter. I don't care what the world said about sovereign nations after World War II. That might doesn't make right. What the Geneva Convention said that you would do if you were in a war, Putin has basically said, I don't care about any of that. I want to reestablish the world's international order in along his rule. So that there makes it a global fight. If Putin would have been allowed to succeed in Ukraine, the whole world would have changed, and it still could change if the world doesn't help Ukraine prevent Putin from doing what he was trying to do in Ukraine. There is this thing called the global international order, which the entire world thrives under economically, politically, in the rules on which nations will interact with each other. And of course, there's been a lot of war around the world. The United States has been involved in multiple wars. Not all wars are the same. This is the most important war since World War II because it has the potential to change the world.
Yeah, and how do you think, John, if you're talking about the parallels between the wars in the past, now many analytics, they try to draw these parallels and find something similar in these wars. Could we compare the war in Ukraine with the other war, or this war especially is unique for the globe?
I mean, there's always uniqueness in war, in the context of the war. The most like war is the World War II, is Hitler's imperialist regime trying to take first Poland and then many other countries. That is the most close similarity. But there are, of course, uniqueness. Putin doesn't have the Soviet Army's military. He doesn't have even the German military of World War II. He has a much smaller, much weaker military, but he still has these very global aspirations of extending the Soviet Union, to whatever imperial wants that he has. That's the most like similarities, but lots of differences in sizes of militaries, in the political context of even economic connections between countries around the world, this ideal of a liberal democracy, and where countries will and won't do. And that's again why I think after World War II, so much work was put into multi-international organizations like the United Nations and other organizations. And now you have the European Union that want to prevent wars of suffering, wars of aggression, wars of personal interest. And then you have to talk about genocide. I mean, the mantra never again, and again, the parallel to Hitler in World War II, Putin wants to erase the Ukrainian identity. He wants to erase their culture, erase them as a people. That's by definition genocide. And he's doing it, and he's attempting to do it in places like Mariupol and in other places. That strong similarity is there. Now, have there been genocides in places like Africa and other places? Absolutely. But then again, this has global implications because Putin wouldn't stop at Ukraine. And I think Ukraine understands that. And hopefully Europe understands that.
And from the point of the aid from United States to other countries, you mentioned that US was involved in a lot of wars. So can we compare the quantity of this aid, military aid, I mean, which Ukraine gets right now, and for example, the other aids they provided in another wars?
Yeah, that would be a hard comparison. I mean, again, this isn't a fight between the U.S. as Ukraine has over 50 nations of free people providing aid to Ukraine, and many of them digging deep into their own coffers and giving more than proportionally than other countries. Like they're actually giving their own equipment, like Poland and other people
Estonia,
who know. Estonia too. But this ideal of once you have the backing of a very large superpower like America, this is again where Putin lost this war. Once America said that we would do everything in our power, which is a great power, to help Ukraine defend its sovereign borders, again, the war was lost because the number one strategy in war is to attack the alliances. Putin wanted the West to let Ukraine go, wanted the U.S. to look away. The U.S. didn't, and the U.S. was a tipping point in World War I. It was a tipping point in World War II, not necessarily with its soldiers, but with its aid, with its arsenal of democracy. How does it compare? If you do a comparative analysis, the U.S. isn't giving what it gave during World War II. There are reasons for that. All war is politics by other means. The U.S. has given a lot, and I'm very proud of them. But I'm also proud of, like you said, Poland, Estonia, Latvia. So many different countries that are giving what they politically can. But I really wish there was another shift that Putin is causing a global tax on the world. And most people understand that, even if they don't agree with what's going on, or if they, for some reason, are just crazy, don't agree with helping Ukraine from a humanitarian aspect. But Putin is imposing a global tax on the world in inflation, in energy cost, in everything. So this is the thing about the common sense of how much aid is given to Ukraine. The more aid is given to Ukraine, the faster this war ends. Putin's already lost, but he's not going to stop until he no longer has the capability to keep going. Military capability. There's a solution to military capability in Ukraine. There's a solution to defeating Russia's military in Ukraine. There's a very little solution to convincing Putin to stop what he's doing. That's almost unachievable, but it's very achievable. And actually, President Zelensky and General Belarusian have put together a list that's very reasonable on, if you give me these things, these tanks, these infantry fighting vehicles, I can defeat Russia in Ukraine.
Yeah, we will talk a little bit further about the aid and everything concerning the military aid. So also all around we can hear now about the new stage of the war in Ukraine, and some Ukrainian officials claim it can be another breakthrough of Ukrainian army in January. So on the other hand, Russian army digs in the east. We know that. Can it be the obstacle to make this turnover on the front line by Ukrainian army?
Yeah, I mean, I too agree that we've gone through many phases, and we're in this phase. We're still in the phase of Russian terrorism through aerial strikes, and hopefully the announcement of the Patriot system and other air defense systems will help reduce this tactic of terrorism that Russia is forced to do. But on the front line, absolutely, Ukraine, the obstacle will be the aid. So what aid continues to flow in, just like artillery rounds, the numbers of artillery rounds that are expended by Ukraine daily is a great amount. And the aid from the UK, from other people to keep that supply going is the one obstacle to Ukraine's advance. Ukraine doesn't have an obstacle in manpower or will to fight. It has the obstacle of weapons. But the longer this goes on, Russia does build capability. It did mobilize, up to 200, 300,000 people. And the longer it can slow Ukrainians down, which I don't think they'll stop over the winter, the more time Russia gets to mobilize more individuals and train them and get them to the front line and to use waves of cannon fodder, or what we call attrition warfare. That won't slow Ukraine, but it will cause greater cost to Ukraine. Ukraine will lose more to achieve their goals the more time that it takes for that aid to get delivered to Ukraine.
Yeah, and which factors will be decisive in the next breakthrough of Ukrainian army? So we could tell weapons from US, that's all, or maybe you could count something else.
I mean, it's hard to, we think we know a lot about the front line, but one of the advantages of Ukraine has to keep going is the intelligence and the surprise on the battlefield. Where the breakthrough happens is both a military and a political decision. Does Melitopol, Bakhmut, Zaporizhia, where the breakthrough happens is a lot of factors. Even weather can be a factor in how cold of a winter will it be, and how much will the ground freeze. There's a science to war, and there's actually an art to war. So predicting war is really hard to do. I don't see anything that's an obstacle for Ukraine to advance. It's just, where does Ukraine decide to advance based on the political decisions and weapons, absolutely, and Russian weaknesses. I mean, Russia cannot maintain, and they've shown this. And this is why I think in the Kharkiv offensive in September, even Ukraine brave soldiers were surprised that the Russians wouldn't fight, and they folded where we thought there would be a greater fight. Though more of that's going to happen. We're going to discover more Russian weaknesses, but they're still dangerous. And if they can flow more people in, it causes a greater challenge, not an obstacle, but greater challenges.
Yeah, and what do you make of Crimea? So I mean that many Ukrainian officials told that Crimea liberation could be in 4 months and somewhere in spring. So how high are chances?
So that's a hard one. All war is politics by other means. Crimea is unique. It is Ukrainian. It is Ukraine. Has a very unique history. And what Russia has done since it's occupied it has been horrible, and basically populating it with Russian citizens, and all the things that they've done. Can Ukraine rapidly take Crimea? Absolutely, if they make that decision. When they make the decision to liberate Crimea will be the question, based on the other elements of the operation, the situation in other places. I cannot wait personally to visit Mariupol myself, as I walk the ground of massive battles like I did the Battle of Kyiv, and that battle will become legend. But Crimea is as much a military question as it is a political question, because we really don't know what are the true red lines for Russia and where it will divert its forces to save. Like we thought Kherson was going to be a much larger battle than it ended up being because Russia made a political decision to retreat. Would they ship forces out of the Donbass in order to save, their illegal occupation of Crimea? Maybe. Ukraine has the possibility, but it's more of a political decision on what will that implications be in the other front as well. And but it's nobody's decision but Ukraine's decision when to do it. And I like President Zelensky's comment that the war ends and he looks forward to being on the beach in Crimea when this is over.
But John, to get to Crimea, Ukrainian army should occupy the whole Kherson region. So, but there is one obstacle, Dnipro River. So, how do you feel how Ukrainian army could get through it?
Yeah, I mean, you have to destroy the Russian military on the other side of the Dnieper first. You could cross the Dnieper in a different area in the Zaporizhia Oblast and come down the north, from a different location. Those obstacles are relatively easy, but Ukraine does have a limitation on size. Most people don't understand just the geographic areas we're talking about, how large they are, and how many tens of thousands of soldiers you need with all the equipment that they require. This is why one of the highest, I know we're going to talk about later, but I understand as a former soldier myself, why you need 700, 800 armored personnel carriers is to cross large amounts of areas. I don't think the Dnieper is as much an obstacle to Ukraine as destroying the Russian military to their front. They need a lot of firepower to do that. And then they can do an unimposed crossing of the river, or they can just cross, farther north.
Yeah, and if we're talking about the goals of Putin, so we know that for now, yes, Putin invests a lot in Belarusian private army and increases military forces. So, what do you read in these steps? What are the goals Putin pursue right now?
Yeah, I think right now Russia or Putin is his strategy is to buy time. So I think activities in Belarus, activities with the Russian missile terrorism campaign, I think it's all both to impose cost on Ukraine, to impose cost on the West, but most importantly is to buy time. Even in his reduced objectives in this war, which happened in April, when he said, okay, now we're only going to focus on the Donbass and southern Ukraine. And even when he signed into illegally, as voted by the entire UN body, he signed 4 areas of Ukraine into the Russian constitution and called them Russia, but then loses Kherson quickly after that. He's in a campaign of not losing more than he's already lost. That's why I said earlier, it's hard to understand what is his truly want now. What can truly be his goals now? Is it Crimea and the Donbass alone? I don't know, but I know that he's trying to buy time. And the Belarus is a diversion. It's maybe a deception. It does require Ukraine to allocate resources to the potential of anything coming out of Belarus, whether it's Russian or Belarusian. But they're all strategies of weakness and strategies to buy time. But thankfully, things like the sanctions were actually causing him to run out of time. And he's running out of military capability. The numbers of artillery rounds that Russia fires has gone down because they're running out of artillery rounds and they're relying on older artillery supplies. This is why I don't agree with the analysts who say this war can go on for years. I just personally don't think Russia has the capability to continue this war for years.
Yeah, but John, we heard the last public speech of Putin, and he told that there is there are no limits of financing military forces, and then they could invest more in producing new military stuff and so on, so on. And then they have a lot of candle, as you told. So what I heard, so financially they could invest in the war for 5 years, what I heard from the economists. What are your anti-arguments, I mean, in it?
Sure. So there is a this element of diminishing returns. So Putin's already expended his best military forces.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you do another mobilization. Yes, the 300,000 people that he mobilized, but what advanced weapons are you going to give them? What tanks? What advanced artillery? There is no giant stockpiles of equipment, and the sanctions are actually working on the preventing things from advanced missile systems and others from working. But I think some of that analysis hopes that everything on the Ukraine side slows down. Russia can't keep this up for maybe it can keep giving soldiers to die in Ukraine. Absolutely. Yeah, he has a very large manpower capability, but there is diminishing returns. It takes years to train a general. It takes years to train any officer to be able to have military capability on the battlefield. And oh, by the way, when Russia called up his last mobilization, there were more men who left the country than who joined the military. That has an economic impact on the society's ability to fight a war. Even if they were behind Putin, which they're not, this is not a war for Russia. And the people know that. And that's why, 400,000 adult males left the country. If he tries to continue this, more of that will continue. But he does have an economic strong point in his energy reserves, but the EU and others are making hard decisions to prevent that from being how he can continue this war. Mm-hmm. But a nation's ability to fight a war is both its means and its will. Russian soldiers don't have the will to fight for years. Maybe you have some, but again, this is diminishing returns. This is why calculating military capabilities is so hard. Mm-hmm. I think while Ukraine is absolutely suffering in the war, it loses soldiers, and nobody's denying that. But Ukraine gets stronger as this war continues. They have tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers training outside of Ukraine who return to Ukraine as coherent formations. Russia doesn't have that capability. Russia doesn't have an endless, although the supply is not endless, it doesn't have the best weapons of the world. It's turning to Iran and North Korea for resupplies. Mm-hmm. That's going to be a lesser quality war. So, if Russia wants to think it can continue this war for 5 years economically, it's just not true.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and about sanctions, we know that there were 9 packets of sanctions against Russia. And then recently, United States announced another sanctions against 10 Russian entities that support the Kremlin's naval operations. And but on the other hand, I had yesterday an interview with one American expert, and he talked to me that that they use black market, and it's any problem for Iran, Venezuela, and so on. So what sanctions could really stop this financing of the war?
Yeah.
Sanctions, I heard that our Ukrainian experts told me, if it is secondary sanctions, Russia will be suffered very much, and it could stop the war. So financing.
Yeah. So the challenge with the sanctions is that sanctions are trying to coerce Putin to stop. I think it absolutely has to continue, and all nations have to work on preventing those loopholes, right? The way to get around the sanctions, and to sanction the countries that work with Putin, like Iran, more so, or any other country that provides Putin capability to continue its illegal activities in Ukraine. But as a military guy, and I do understand the economic sanctions, and it is having an impact. But the problem is that the people that you're trying to change their minds don't care about how much the Russian people suffer.
Mm-hmm.
The for me, the path to Ukraine's inevitable victory is the destruction of the Russian military in Ukraine. While the sanctions help, like the sanctions on microchips and other advanced capabilities, are significant. If you destroy a majority of the Russian formations in Ukraine, doesn't matter what Russia wants to do, it just doesn't have the capability to do it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I agree with the experts that there needs to be more economic sanctions. You need to you can sanction Putin himself. You can sanction Putin's inner circle himself. Lots of sanctions that have not happened yet, and I don't agree that they haven't. Uh, you know, but I still think the fastest way to end this war is to provide the systems that will allow the Russian military or the Ukrainian military to cause the Russian military to culminate. Once Ukraine takes back its land, it's going to be near impossible for Russia to build the capability to then do a counterattack. It doesn't have that. It's lost so many of its good forces. It's so many of its critical capabilities. While every missile that hits Ukraine is a war crime, it's one less missile that Russia can rebuild.
Yeah, I could feel it here in Kiev. I could tell you that on Sunday's night, I felt very afraid of the rockets because it was near my place of living in Bukhil, and it was like 8 or 7 explosions, and I could tell you that it's feeling that I couldn't even express how it feels when it's very near yeah. So okay, but there was one situation with Iranian drones. American experts told that in Iranian drones there were components, American components. How it could be happened if there is there were imposed sanctions against Russia using international components, I mean American components in their military stuff.
Yeah, that's an interesting reporting. I mean, it doesn't surprise me. It's like we've seen even with Russia this year. There are ways around sanctions. There are loopholes. There are black markets. There are, it's a complex, interconnected world. I do think Iran should be held strongly accountable for its strong support of Russia in this campaign, in this phase of the war. So, although it's one of the most sanctioned countries in the world, the Islamic regime should be even more sanctioned because of its aid here. Yeah, there's an investigation ongoing on how that happened, how the American components found its way, but it doesn't surprise me as Iran has been working for years. I mean, it's been over a decade long, very long, that they figure out ways to get around the loopholes. They have some friends like Russia that allow them to escape some of the impacts of the sanctions, but once they show their hands like they have, the interesting question is, what did Russia promise Iran for its help when it's so weak? So that will be the interesting question on what Iran thinks it gets from supporting this evil.
Yeah, and let's talk a little bit about military aid. You told in one of the interviews that states should make hard decisions for themselves. Mainly, I could understand that White House should make a hard decision. And what can we state for now? There the pivotal moment in the vision of the military aid to Ukraine after, for example, the visit of Zelensky to US. What do you make of it? Can we expect for long-range missiles and more Patriots, not one for one region?
Yeah, I think so. Do I think there's a giant shift? I hope so. And I'm hearing a lot of things from not from the White House, but actually from congressmen who were moved by President Zelensky's speech, who are saying that we aren't giving the right weapons, like Republican congressmen who say we're not giving the weapons they need. That is really showing the results of President Zelensky's courage to leave the country and to do a face-to-face, because there are things that happens face-to-face that you don't get virtually. The Patriot system, it's a defensive weapon. I don't think it's the panacea of air defense. But I think, like the HIMARS, there has been a kind of precedence on American weapon systems. And it's not just America, it's Ukraine, United Kingdom, other countries, that they give one small package as the door opener, like they did the HIMARS, where they only gave 4 originally.
So this pivotal moment happened.
Yeah. So the one Patriot will hopefully equal a bunch more Patriots to close the air. I mean, the defensive weapons I think are good, and I can't wait so the Ukrainian civilians don't live in fear of what's in the sky, because it's not just the Patriot, it's the NASAMS, the IRST, the many other air defense systems that will take all these tools of terrorism away from Putin, which then he'll be in even a worse place than he is now. The question will be, especially next year, right? So if we get the $45 billion package approved by Congress before they recess here today or tomorrow, that will be huge in giving Ukraine the longevity, the feeling of this isn't a month-to-month thing. That's a long term. But we need congressmen and other political leaders to do the influence it takes to understand the risk of escalation, but also understand the risk of allowing this to continue. Because I strongly believe the longer that the world makes these political risk decisions that, this weapon, like the ATACMS long-range artillery system or tanks or whatever, that's an escalation that could cause Putin to do something else. To do what? I don't understand. The longer this goes on, the greater risk there is to escalation and spillover to other countries. The longer Ukraine has to fight this by incremental political decisions of different weapon systems, rather than just giving them the reasonable list of things that aren't advanced technologies, which is some ridiculous other conversation that, an advanced technology will fall in the hands of the Russians. Like what is it for if it's not to defeat the peer competitor to the United States, which is Russia? So Russia's a threat to Ukraine today. It's a threat to the world, and its actions prove that. I don't know if it's I don't know if President Zelensky convinced enough people around the world that if you give us these systems, we can end this war quicker. I hope so. But that is a very complex political conversation.
Yeah, but how could you explain for our audience why White House in this case is so slow?
It's because it's not one person that makes a decision. Just like everywhere else, there's so many different stakeholders who have an opinion on what are the second and third order effects of any decision, especially a weapon system. Whether
But I thought Biden could decide.
No, well, Biden can decide, but I mean, the way our system works, the president takes advice from the head of the Joint Chief of Staff, from the National Security Council, from the Department of State. There is a very rigorous advising. Absolutely, the president could take leadership and say, "I understand the risk. Give them what they need now," and that's the leadership that I think. Again, President Zelensky is showing the world. That's no teleprompter, no script, just pure leadership. That's what I would like to see from not just the United States, but from many leaders. Like, look, I understand the risk. The greatest risk is allowing Putin to prevail in Ukraine. So the greatest prudent leadership would be going full in. And like President Zelensky said, nobody's asking for anybody else's troops to fight in Ukraine. I love the comment of, trust me, Ukrainian soldiers can drive American tanks and planes by themselves.
Yeah, but John, how do you feel? Survived mode is over for Ukraine right now concerning the military stuff, or it still works?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I personally think up to this point, Ukraine has been given what it needed to not lose. Ukraine has not received what it needs to win. Have we reached that tipping point? I sure hope so. And it will be really interesting as we move into the new year. For us, we'll have a new leadership in our government, in our Congress, especially in the House. But we're not the only people a part of this 50 plus nations. We could take the leadership role, and hopefully the Patriot then opens the door like we've seen in the past. But yes, the whole world needs to do a shift from giving Ukraine what it needs to not just not lose, but to win. And people need to start saying it like that too. Although I agree that they need defensive weapons, the conversation needs to not be about only defensive capabilities. It needs to be about what it needs to achieve a very reasonable objective on the battlefield. And that is destroying the Russian military in Ukraine. And Ukraine is given the guarantees. It's given the guarantees which should quiet the opposition that we can't give Ukraine weapons in which it can strike into Russian territory. One, it should be nobody should tell Ukraine it can't strike a Russian military capability in Russia that is killing Ukrainian civilians. That's just unreasonable. But Ukraine has shown since February that it is a trusted partner, and it will use the capabilities in accordance with the person that gives the capabilities to destroy Russian military in Ukraine in its sovereign land. So that's another ridiculous argument.
Yeah, but another thing, Biden has huge support from Americans, as I know. So many of Americans even would like to increase the military aid to Ukraine. So what the problem for Biden? It's a good idea to make this military aid better because he wins from this. So it will be a good win for the electorate and for his future.
Maybe that's a complex political conversation. There is opposition. In every president, he faces re-election in 2 years. I mean, I think a good sign is that Congress increased the amount that President Biden and the White House asked for Ukraine. They only asked for about 38 billion, and Congress increased that to 45 billion. Hopefully that'll be approved. That's a great sign that there is bipartisan support. So I think this has to be more than a political decision for President Biden. This has to be a personal decision. It has to be a decision about his values and his beliefs. He, of course, is the leader of our country and has to take the risk the risk. And now we have to talk about the risk of nuclear escalation. So he has to take that into account. But this is, again, why that risk has to be subordinate to the risk of allowing this to continue, because that's the risk. I personally do not believe that Putin could ever use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, because the trajectory of nuclear weapons and the reasons that you can use them, it's a survival weapon, and nobody is threatening the survival of Russia. If Putin used a nuclear weapon, it would be the end of Putin. It would be the end of the Russian Federation. But nobody wins a nuclear war. President Biden and all leaders of every country have to take that into account. But that's the problem with this political risk calculation. Putin is trying to reestablish the rules of the world, and one of those rules is the fact that I have a nuclear weapon means I can do anything I want to any country that's not in NATO. And that is not the rule that we want to allow him to establish. And again, there's a clear solution to this problem, and that is helping Ukraine defend its sovereign territory. And Russia can go back to Russians can go back to Russia and do whatever they want, but you don't get to invade another country just because you have a nuclear weapon.
And another thing, we know that Russia told us that, I mean, Putin told that they are preparing something on the south direction. So the second attempt of invasion from Belarusian border is the last chance for Putin.
I mean, Putin's last chance at achieving that ultimate maximus goal of controlling Ukraine died in April when he couldn't take Kyiv. As a military analyst, although I will listen to President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny when he said it's a credible threat, as a urban warfare specialist, the Russian military had one chance and they blew it for many reasons. I personally think that they just don't have a military capability to do that ever again.
But still, they are preparing something. They are investing in the military forces and so on, so on. So, any chances? So they could start this invasion.
Yeah, they could sacrifice thousands more along in another attempt.
Mm-hmm.
But there, you have to talk about likelihood of success.
So they will lose more than they would get. Yeah.
Absolutely, they would lose. They would not get anything other than basically causing the Ukrainian military to have focus on multiple areas of the country, and that's been a goal in multiple phases of this war. So, are they willing to sacrifice tens of thousands more soldiers, even coming, And they would love, I think, to sacrifice Belarusian soldiers, but then you have to question Belarusian, Lukashenko's and others' capability to keep power in their own country if they do that. Mm-hmm. But I'm sure Putin would love to send thousands of Belarusians south to attack into Ukraine. Very questionable on would the Belarusian soldiers even follow that order. Very questionable on whether Lukashenko could maintain power in Belarus if that happened. Again, these are all likelihoods. You can't predict the war or the actions of Putin for sure. When it's not reasonable to just continue his war. Will he continue? Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Like I said, I strongly believe that Ukraine gets stronger as this war goes on in military capability.
But how do you estimate for now military capability of Ukraine in the case if Russia invades Ukraine one more time from Belarus?
Yeah, from Belarus.
Yeah.
So look, just like when they attacked very strongly out of Belarus in February. Kyiv is an ancient city for a reason. Its terrain matters. If you can't fly things into it, like through Hostomel, which Kyiv now has increased its air defense capabilities. If you try to drive into Kyiv, there are very narrow approaches into Kyiv, which allows Kyiv to have a very strong defense that can destroy formations as they come at Kyiv. And this, the Ukrainian citizens defeated Russia. A huge part of them did in the Battle of Kyiv won. I don't think there'll ever be another Battle of Kyiv, but if they attempted to do it, we have these analogies like the meat grinder, the wood chipper, things like that. The way that Kyiv sits, it's the fact that it's this ancient city sitting on hilltops allows it to be very defendable. So if that happened, there would be, the road would be littered with destroyed vehicles and dead soldiers, and they wouldn't be Ukrainians.
Yeah, and the last but not the least, John, how many scenarios you can project for the next year, 2023, over the war in Ukraine? So how many scenarios you have in your mind right now?
So I only have about 3 or 4, and they're all just where does Ukraine liberate first? There is a scenario in which Russia attempts, because the enemy gets a vote, attempts to mass forces somewhere. You would think that they would mass formations to protect Crimea. It's not what they've done so far. You would think if that's a very high political goal is to maintain it illegally, that they would mass formations there. Or is it the Donbass that they really are concerned about? But all the scenarios are just, and I don't know this, and I don't think any of us can, is of all the scenarios, just for me, is where does Ukraine push into next? Does it liberate Luhansk or Donetsk? Does it shoot south to cut off the land bridge and take Mariupol back? And then cause a real problem in the Sea of Azov. There's lots of scenarios here, but for all my scenarios have Ukrainians on the offense.
You expect such events in spring?
I think there'll be a winter offense. I don't think I have to wait till the spring to see something. I don't think the Ukrainians are going to sit still during the winter. I think there'll be a planned operation of some type during. Yes.
Yeah, and what can force Russia to meet the terms of Ukraine if negotiations could come up?
Yeah, so I think my personal opinion is that the only thing that will force Russia to come to any type of political table will be the culmination of its forces in the Donbass and the rapid loss of major portions of areas that even they held since 2008. I think that they will be. These are all just guesses. That would force them to say, okay, let's talk about terms. But Ukraine comes at that table at a very big position of strength. So will Putin ever do that? Who knows? But the culmination of its military is the path. If he cannot hold ground anymore and he's rapidly he's going to start talking about, I'm ready to have a conversation. And he probably will offer, as long as you allow me to keep Crimea, which that's Ukraine's decision. Of course, Ukraine says that we're going to occupy or to liberate all of our land and reestablish borders since 1991 and since the independence, and that should be it. But all war does end in a political negotiation. Hopefully that negotiation is Ukrainians' terms of all of our land and a giant DMZ or demilitarized zones established between Russia and Ukraine a strong member of NATO. That would be ideal, but I can't even predict what Putin would ever offer to stop the war.
Yeah, we'll see how it's going on. John, thank you very much for everything you told me today, for this fruitful talk. And also, I appreciate the support of Ukraine. And I would like to tell thank you to all the Americans who support us here during the war. So thank you very much for your time.
Well,
yeah.
Slava Ukraini.
Yeah, Heroям Slava. Yes, so thank you very much.